it was in the interests of the Soviet Union for Germany to have it cast its attention on this country, on Great Britain. So as long as they did that, that would minimise the chances of when they were going to turn on the Soviet Union.
Hello. On the 9th of February 1933, the Oxford Union held a debate with the motion that this House will under no circumstances fight for its king and country. The motion passed, and in a time when such debates were big news, the result sent shockwaves through Europe. This was during the rise of the Nazis, the Soviet grip on Russia, and throughout the decade there was an increase in the number of spies and traitors in England. Joining me is Alex Gerlis, author of Every Spy a Traitor, as we delve into the atmosphere of the 1930s as impressionable young men and women examined their consciences and in some cases came up with the wrong answer. Coming up, plenty more great history, including the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Hitler and his henchmen, and much, much more. But until then, I'll hand you over to me talking with Alex Gerlis on 1930s Traitors. Alex, welcome back onto the pod. Great to have you on again.
Thank you. Good to see you, Ollie.
And we are talking about your new novel, Every Spy a Traitor. And it ticks all the boxes of a spy thriller that I look for because it involves Russia, it involves British, Oxbridge educated spies. There's travel through the continent. It's got everything that you require of it. Have you always wanted to write a book like this? Because it's slightly different to your previous ones.
Yes, someone else said that to me the other day, and they also said they thought that the style was a bit different. They said they thought there was a bit more humour in it, but I think I was trying. I think the character is a bit different. He's the main character, Charles Cooper, is a bit of an innocent who kind of finds himself through circumstance, kind of drawn into this murky world of espionage and everything. And I kind of wanted to reflect that a little bit, but to answer the question specifically in terms of why I always wanted to do this, well, I think it's I've done mainly Second World War, as you know. One of my novels, The Berlin Spies, dipped into the Cold War, but they've been almost exclusively set in the Second World War, and I just felt I wanted to try something a little bit different. The first novel is before the war, and the fourth in the series will be after the war. 2 and 3 will be during the war. And I think maybe even subconsciously, it just has got a slightly different feel to it, not being during in the Second World War. So it's at a different time. So I think when a country, and quite a lot of it is set in Britain, I think when a country is at war, the atmosphere is inevitably different to when it's not at war. And this country in the mid-late 30s wasn't at war, and it wasn't as if the clouds of war were hanging over Britain in the same way that there were other countries in Europe. I know that as we got into 1939, it all became very much of an issue, but I still don't think it was the same. So I think I was probably trying to reflect that.
Well, it's funny you say that, actually, because I recently was rereading Patrick Leigh Fermor's stuff, and he travels through the continent much like your character does, although in Paddy's case on foot. And he does deal with the rise of the Nazis. But one thing that I wanted to ask you about was because Leigh Fermor mentions about the debate that took place in Oxford University. There was an Oxford Union debate about whether the students would go to war.
Would you fight for king and country? Was the
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the result of that debate, they took a vote, and the motion was rejected. So basically, Oxford students were saying they wouldn't go and fight for king and country. Obviously, World War One looming all over it, and that had been heard on the continent with sort of concern, with worry. And your characters, there's the Oxford University is involved in the book. Is that something that you kind of try and bring across?
I think to an extent, yes. I mean, I think that there was in terms of what people's priorities were and what the appetite was, I was quite interested in the attitude of the Foreign Office. I think this comes across, and but the attitude of the Foreign Office towards espionage was very disparaging. They didn't agree with it. I think it was almost an old-fashioned kind of thing where they might have thought it's not quite cricket, it's not the done thing. So much so that the British Embassy in Berlin wouldn't allow the MI6 station to be based at the embassy. So the cover for the MI6 station in Berlin leading up to the war was the passport control office. And that was, they had to have their own office around on Tiergartenstrasse. And they didn't have, the senior MI6 officers there didn't have diplomatic status. I mean, fortunately, they were never caught, but had they been, they wouldn't have had that kind of protection. And there was that feeling that it was all kind of not quite the done thing. The other thing as well, which I think is important to remember, and it was one of the reasons why you could argue that this country got caught out in many ways, was that almost up until August 1939, certainly September 1939, the priority was still communism. The real threat perceived by the establishment, by the Foreign Office, even MI6, was communism. So there were fewer people taking an interest in what was going on in North Germany. Not that it was being ignored, but it was, if you'd have actually put someone on the spot and said, what is it in 1938, for example, and said, what is the bigger threat to this country? Nazi Germany, Hitler's Germany, or Stalin's Soviet Union, I think 9 out of 10 would have said the Soviet Union. And that infected British policy right up to and arguably well into the war. And where that came from is difficult to say, but I suppose in class terms, you could say that the communism was seen as a very direct threat to the ruling class, whereas Nazi Germany, it was all a bit more, it wasn't quite as clear. He was doing what he could to sort his own country out and wasn't a direct threat here. Funnily enough, I'm just been doing a lot of research on the book I'm writing at the moment, which is the follow-up to Every Spy a Traitor. And it's very interesting to read about how strong the moves towards the appeasement lobby continued well into the Second World War. So right up until Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, the expectation was that Halifax will get the job. The King wanted Halifax. The majority of Conservative MPs wanted Halifax. The majority of Conservative peers wanted Halifax. But Labour said they wouldn't work with Halifax, and Churchill got the job. But up to then, and even afterwards, the Germans still thought that the British would sue for peace. They didn't think that they were strong enough, even though 300,000 more British troops got back from Dunkirk than were expected. They were still in a pretty weak state, and the British defences were very poor. So that was what the Germans were hoping, is that Britain would sue for peace. And I think all of these attitudes, all of these beliefs can start in the 30s, if not earlier, and go through well into 1940. You could arguably up until and during the Battle of Britain.
But then, also conversely, there are a lot of people in the upper classes, in universities, who are very interested in communism. So much so, as we know from the Cambridge spy ring, that they're willing to betray their own country.
I don't know how many it was. I mean, there was certainly a strain of people, wasn't it? Who were, that. I mean, Blunt, Philby, Maclean, Burgess. We know about them. Klugman as well, Cairncross. So these people were there. How big the numbers were is a bit unclear. And it was obviously, and then these were the ones that were actually committed and went off to be Soviet agents. In terms of fellow travellers, people that would kind of, nod and wink or kind of support them or not disagree with them. Well, that's a bit unclear, but I'm not sure how big the numbers were. But you're absolutely right. There was certainly that school of thought as well.
Yes, I remember, and I think when Anthony Blunt was exposed in the late 70s, I think it might have been Jim Callahan who's because it was under a conservative government. I think Jim Callaghan, who was must have been in the backbenchers, had stood up and said in the House of Commons that whilst he obviously didn't condone what Blunt did, it at the time the communism was seen as the sort of only bulwark against Nazism.
Yeah, I mean, Dennis Healy, of course, was a communist at Oxford.
Oh, was he?
Oh yeah, he was a communist at Oxford and was quite open about it. If he was ever asked about it, he said, "Yes, and I used to believe in Father Christmas as well." So it was definitely there, and it wasn't just. I mean, he came from a kind of lower middle class background into or working class Dennis Healy. It wasn't just the aristocracy or people who were from very moneyed background that went along with it. It was a fairly common trend, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, um, the Nazi Soviet pact though is this sort of seminal moment when they actually ally the two ideologies, which is just extraordinary.
Well, it shook quite a lot of people in the Communist Party. It didn't lead to mass resignations, but it caused a lot of problems for people that had been. The party line must be very anti-Nazi, and then suddenly the party line is lay off, and that shook people. That shook people a lot. Not, I think, it has to be said as much as Hungary did in '56, which apparently had a much more dramatic effect on party membership, for instance. But if you read Francis Bennett's history of the Communist Party, it's very interesting to read about what was happening at the top of the Communist Party on the Politburo. So there were three or four people who held out against it, but what was happening is messages were coming through Comintern from Moscow, through Comintern from Moscow, saying this is now the line. And it was very, very difficult for a lot of people to hold, although having said that, they were fairly disciplined about it. But it must have been completely odd, that you're suddenly told 1 minute that those guys that were our enemies, they're now not so much friends, but they were, they never saw themselves as allies. It was a non-aggression pact. So it was kind of like partners rather than allies. But I've spoken to a couple of people who were Communist Party members, and when you raise this with them, and they talk. I mean, there was quite a lot of talk yesterday about the fact that Putin wasn't invited to D-Day, and how many million Red Army soldiers died to help defeat the Nazis. All of which is true, of course. And, one shouldn't forget that. But nor should one forget the fact that for 2 years, the first 2 years of the war, almost 2 years, from September, from late August 1939 until June the 21st, 1941, these guys were on the same side. And, we shouldn't forget that either. That's another important consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. One of your characters in the novel is I don't want to give anything away for listeners at all,
Yeah.
but um, I don't think I am by saying that one of your characters is a communist.
Hmm.
Because obviously, if you're writing a character, you have to sort of, I don't know, do you put yourself in their shoes? And so how did you view that kind of communist belief in that period?
Well, the reflection you made about whether you put yourself in their shoes, I think that most fiction authors would say that when you're creating characters, and particularly fairly main characters, you kind of got to get to know them. You've got to go through a process where, as if they're a friend or an acquaintance, and so you know what they're like. So you think about them an awful lot, and sometimes I find that in my mind the distinction between reality, between what's real and what's not real, becomes a bit blurred. Sometimes it's a little bit worrying. You think, are they real? I've often thought of some of the main characters as people, as if they're real people that I know,
Yeah.
which is quite an interesting and sometimes slightly unnerving process. So in terms of what I think about them, well, the main character that you're talking about, who appears in this book, who is the main traitor in the Every Spy, a traitor, and indeed he carries on being a traitor through all 4 books, only to be unmasked at the end of book 4, which I can tell you is a hell of a task to kind of not unmask him, however inadvertently. But I don't think he's painted as a particularly sympathetic character. He goes into it for more or less ideological reasons, but I don't think because someone follows a belief, if you like, for ideological reasons is necessarily a laudable thing. Because you could just as much say, well, someone that followed the Nazi cause for ideological reasons, you wouldn't try and say, well, you can kind of see it from their point of view. Their dad lost his job after the First World War, and there was mass unemployment and hyperinflation in Germany. So you can't, and the Jews control the businesses and this, that, and the other. So you can't blame them. So you shouldn't really make excuses to people. But I think you've got to get inside them. So you've got to see it a bit from their point of view. I don't think you can just say that character X joined the Communist Party at Oxford and then becomes a Russian spy. You've got to try and explain a little bit more. And then you've got to paint a bit of a picture about their background and where they're from. And in upper class and more allusions to kind of schools and clubs and things like that. They've got to be a fairly rounded character.
And it's okay. So you've mentioned individuals joining the Nazi party, but why do you think, if you're a communist, I mean, there are people who say on telly quite openly now, I'm a communist. And no one would ever say, oh, I'm a Nazi. Yet the communist ideology has killed as many as Nazism.
Yeah, I think without defending it, I think someone.
I'm not outing you as a communist.
No, I'm not. But I'm not. I'm not a communist. I never have been. I've never been a Marxist. So
Yeah.
I don't.
You never dabbled in youth? I mean, everyone sort of dabbles in things in sort of strange political opinions when they're young.
No, I don't. No, absolutely not. I mean, I've never made a secret. Well, since leaving the BBC, I've never made a secret that my politics are of the left, but they're kind of centre left. Never more than that. I think, but if a kind of Marxist would sit here and they would pick you up on what you said, and they would say, well, absolutely, Stalin, Mao, completely get it, but they weren't really communists in that sense. I mean, there's the famous clip of Diane Abbott on the Andrew Neil late night show when she was with Michael Portillo, and she said that what the good that Mao did well outweighed the bad, and you could also employ that kind of warped logic to say that Hitler got the trains to run on time and the roads were sorted, none of which is true, by the way, but the infrastructure wasn't quite as wonderful as people think, but you take the point. So I think you're saying really whether there was any sympathy or understanding of it. I mean, it was, communism in the Soviet Union, as originally perceived, was replacing oppression and terror and the dictatorship of the Tsars. So it was replacing it with something that, whilst not identical, was kind of also similar, also very oppressive. And you could argue that they've gone back to that now.
Yes, indeed. So we can expect after this one, this novel, we then move into the war. And so because we did have Soviet spies working in the British government. Are you using the Cambridge spy ring as a kind of a model? Did they give you the idea?
Not quite. I mean, it's one main character, so it's not kind of particularly a spy ring. So it's the one main character. So the second book, which is the one I'm writing at the moment, is set in 1940, and is set against the backdrop of Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's plans to invade this country in 1940. And all the plot's based around that, because there was quite a Soviet interest in that. The Soviet Union was the people that knew in Moscow, like the NKVD, none of them ever particularly trusted the Germans. The person that trusted the Germans was Stalin, ironically. There was a lot of evidence emerged during 1940 and up to June 1941 that there was going to be a point at which the Germans would turn on the Russians. And whenever that got anywhere near Stalin, he dismissed it and said it was the British stirring everything up. There's a famous occasion when, because remember, Berlin had quite a strong communist tradition, and there were still communists around, and they were printing for the Wehrmacht a guide to Russia for when they invaded it, like a phrase book and maps and that. And at the printers, there was a communist, obviously a secret communist, and he got hold of a copy, managed to smuggle it out, and amazingly managed to smuggle it into the Soviet embassy, that enormous building on the Unter den Linden. And it's enormous risk. He was never caught. And when that went back to Moscow, so they knew that they couldn't absolutely rely. They knew it was a matter of time before Germany turned on Russia. And one of the things that I'm interested in, which is kind of around the plot of what I'm writing, without wanting to give away too much about the next book, let alone this one, is it was in the interests of the Soviet Union for Germany to have it cast its attention on this country, on Great Britain. So as long as they did that, that would minimize the chances of when they were going to turn on the Soviet Union. So had, for instance, in May 1940, Halifax been elected as Prime Minister, appointed as Prime Minister, and almost immediately he'd sued for peace, and the Duke of Windsor would have been would have turned up as the new head of state. All of these things that the imagined histories show, which are many of which are quite feasible. Then, as soon as that would have happened, Germany would have immediately, so at some stage in 1940, turned its attention to the Soviet Union. And we know, of course, what happened with Operation Barbarossa, that by the time they got anywhere near Moscow, it was too late. It was that they hit the winter and they got bogged down. I mean, they were within artillery sound of Moscow, and it was then too late. Well, you could argue that had an appeasing prime minister taken over from Chamberlain, I mean, he was something of an appeaser anyway, but had someone like Halifax, and they'd gone for peace, and there had been some kind of odd peace arrangement between Britain and Nazi Germany, for instance, in March or April, then even a month or two earlier, had they then gone for the Soviet Union, it would have made that much difference, because they were delayed they started in June 21, which was arguably 3 or 4 weeks too late to get to Moscow in time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was discussing D-Day with two historians, one of whom was speculating if there had been a delay of D-Day because the weather, it quite possibly could have been. And you've written about D-Day, so you know all about this. In fact, you've written a non-fiction book about D-Day as well, haven't you?
Yeah, a short one, yeah.
And how further the Red Army could have got, with a delayed Allied invasion of France.
Well, there is the book that has come out relatively recently, isn't there, which says that Blunt betrayed Arnhem because that then delayed the British getting into Germany, and it meant that the Red Army could get to Berlin first. So, who knows? But it had, I mean, the point about the 6th of June was that it was meant to be the 5th of June, as we know, and the British meteorologist was absolutely convinced that the 6th provided a window, and Eisenhower said to him very bluntly, "Is it okay to go on the 6th?" And he said yes, which was contrary a bit to what the American meteorologist was saying. So that was a fairly narrow window. And, who knows what would have happened.
If they hadn't gone on the 6th, could they have... They would have gone within a few days, wouldn't they? Or would they have had to...
Well,
because you have to stand... You can't keep the army the troops on alert for a long time, can you?
No, but there's something to do with whether it was tides and on one thing and another. But had they not been able to go on the 6th, the delay would have been longer than a couple of days. And I don't think that was just due... I mean, they were getting intelligence. There's no doubt about it. They were getting intelligence, the Germans, that something was going on the south coast. They didn't act properly on it. but von Rundstedt was told that he thought something was going on, and he ignored it, and that they allowed a lot of officers to go on leave, and there is that history. There was a gathering. They had some kind of training conference for officers in Rennes that was going on at the same time. And Rommel went back to Berlin because it was his wife's birthday, and another general was with his mistress in Paris. It was a complete mess. So you could argue that had their intelligence hardened up a bit, they didn't have much in the way of aspiring over here anyway, as you probably know, which is something that I often touch on. They barely had any intelligence over here, but you pick things up anyway.
Well, they had a spy that the British had flipped, hadn't they?
They had a lot of spies that the British had flipped. The double cross system was incredibly effective. I mean, what did happen, and this is what I'm writing about at the moment, Operation Sea Lion was never popular among the Kriegsmarine. The Navy didn't like it. Goering didn't like it. Even the army had doubts about it. And the Abwehr, military intelligence, picked this up. And there is a theory, which has never quite been proven, but there is a theory nonetheless, that the Abwehr deliberately sent over really third-rate agents, Ollie. I mean, you read about these guys and you couldn't imagine more ill-equipped and unsuitable people to be spying for you. They tended to be like Dutch Nazis who spoke English badly but with an accent. And so there are various stories about how they turned up. There's the famous ones who arrived by dinghy off a U-boat, no, sorry, off a fishing boat from Boulogne, and they arrived near Hythe, and at a village near Hythe in Kent, the landlady had a knock on the door at 9 a.m, and there's a guy there dripping wet in a foreign accent asking for a pint of champagne cider. And the landlady, who'd obviously kind of clocked the, be careful kind of messages that were around at the time, said, could he come back in an hour and she'd be open then? And she knew that there were a couple of RAF guys billeted next door. So she kind of got them. And when this guy kind of came back at 10 o'clock for his pint of champagne cider, they nabbed him, marched him off to the police station. And a month later, he's swinging from a rope at Wandsworth. And there were a lot of these. And what tended to happen was some of them, they turned into double agents. Some of them were executed after kind of like one-day trials in camera at the Old Bailey. And it does seem that the agents were so poor, as if they were almost going through the motions, sending over spies, but thinking, there is a theory that they knew the invasion would be a disaster. So rather than putting Germany through a disaster, let's lead Hitler to realize that the invasion's got to be cancelled.
Yeah, amazing. Well, this has been fantastic, Alex. So it's out now, Every Spy Traitor. When you're writing the second one now, normally you're way ahead. So have you been taking it easy with this series?
So I'm doing one a year on this series. So I am actually about I do about 110,000 words. I'm actually about 80,000 words into the first draft, so I'm kind of way on schedule. Don't tell my publishers, but I'm probably slightly ahead of schedule at the moment. But that one will go off to them at the end of October, and will be out hopefully this time next year.
Great stuff.
And the series goes on to book 4. It's not impossible there could be a book 5. It will just depend on how I feel about it and who I kill between now and then.
Well, then moving into the Cold War as well, that would be
yes. Well, that's what I'm. The idea is that the series ends in 1956, which was a key year because it was the Khrushchev speech denouncing Stalin in the early part of the year, and then it was the Hungarian uprising. But the idea of maybe getting into the 60s and Cold War has a certain appeal to it. I don't know. You've got to think about the age of your characters as well, and you don't want people that are too old.
Well, yeah, true. I can't get enough of the sort of Cold War side of spying. And yes, that's interesting with the Khrushchev speech. I watched The Death of Stalin again the other day, which is quite brilliant.
Really brilliant film, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, Alex, this has been fantastic. Thank you. Listeners, links are in the show notes. But Alex, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ollie. All the best.
Great. Good stuff.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great history is on the way, so please do subscribe or follow. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.